When someone mentions the Motor City, you think of Detroit, Michigan, right? But did you know that Cleveland, Ohio was once known as the Motor City? It's true, and it's quite a story. But first, a little history.
The term Motor City appears to have begun during the post-World War II period. Later, the title became more popular during the 1970s and 80s when various articles and books were written about Detroit as the birthplace of the auto industry.
But about 100 years before that, one city stood alone during those early pioneering days of automotive infancy. Believe it or not, that city was Cleveland, Ohio.
During the 1870s and 1880s, Cleveland was a vibrant, thriving industrial center. In fact, Cleveland led the way in transporting raw materials such as iron ore and coal through its ships along the Great Lakes, canals, and vast networks of railroads.
Cleveland also gained early notoriety for transforming public transportation when it put the first electric streetcar into operation in 1884. By the end of the 1890s, Cleveland's population climbed to over 380,000 and ranked as the 7th largest city in the United States. Compare that to Detroit, which was still lagging behind as the 13th largest city in the country.
Cleveland's industrial base was totally geared to making automobiles, and there were a number of vital factors involved in this recipe for success. First, Cleveland was a leader in steel production during the 1890s. In fact, there were an astounding 147 companies in Cleveland producing iron and steel-related products at this time.
Along with that, the ease of transporting materials needed for steel production and the use of blast furnaces made it very profitable for many of these companies. In total, over 14,000 workers were employed in steel-related businesses alone. By 1900, Cleveland was producing nearly 1 million tons of raw steel and iron per year and ranked 5th nationally.
Secondly, the railroads also played a key role with their vast network of rail throughout the Great Lakes region. Thirdly, let's not forget the oil industry and its refineries. One notable oil baron was Clevelander John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller controlled much of the oil and gas markets at the time through his Standard Oil Company of Ohio, also known as Sohio.
Even though gasoline was a cheap commodity in 1901 after the Texas oil gusher Spindletop came in, the cost of gasoline plummeted from $1 to just a few cents per gallon. Some say it was Rockefeller who campaigned for gasoline motor cars over steam and electric vehicles so as to maintain a steady flow of profits to his oil company.
The advantages of gasoline vehicles were obvious. Electric vehicles needed to be constantly recharged and were limited in travel distance. Steam vehicles were efficient, but still cumbersome and never gained popularity.
Fourthly, yet another integral element in Cleveland's industrial growth was none other than the simple bicycle. Bicycling was a form of social status during the 1880s and 90s, and many Cleveland firms made bicycles.
In fact, Cleveland outnumbered Detroit in bicycle manufacturing 3-1. Pioneering companies such as Peerless, Winton, and White transitioned from making bicycles into making automobiles during the 1890s.
Adding it all up, with the city's vast supply of materials and knowledgeable workforce, the industrial base was a solid foundation to launch into automobile production. And the leader of this transportation revolution was Clevelander Alexander Winton. He experimented with gasoline combustible engines in the basement of his Bolton Place home in 1894 and built his first motor carriage in 1895.
Winton's vehicle was uniquely equipped with the first set of tires made by the B.F. Goodrich Company and were specifically designed for his vehicle. Winton paid $400 for the molds and may have given the idea to others that tires were an important part of the vehicle's design, rather than just taking borrowed parts from wagons and bicycles. The Winton Motor Carriage Company was incorporated on March 15, 1897, and soon began producing cars in lots of 25.
On April 1, 1898, Winton sold the first car of his first lot to Robert Allison of Pennsylvania for $1,000. marking that transaction as the first sale of a commercially sold, mass-produced car in the country.
During the summer of 1897, Winton had driven one of his single-cylinder runabouts all the way to New York City, accompanied by his shop superintendent. They made the trip in 78 hours and 43 minutes over the course of 10 days.
To Winton's dismay, the trip garnered very little publicity. 2 years later, in 1899, Winton repeated the feat, this time sponsored by the Cleveland Plain Dealer and accompanied by reporter Charles B. Shanks. Leaving Cleveland on May 22nd, they made it to New York City in 47 hours and 34 minutes. In only half the time, just 5 days.
During the trip, Shanks telegraphed over 30 reports daily to syndicated periodicals, building big awareness and momentum along the way. That trek is also credited with coining the term automobile, which was a French word that soon became popular in America.
By 1900, there were several other notable automobile makers in Cleveland, namely Baker, Peerless, Stearns, and White, making up what could be called the foremost five. Walter C. Baker founded the American Ball Bearing Company in 1895 and was producing ball bearings for electric motors and streetcars. Inspired by the advances in automotive development, he then formed the Baker Motor Vehicle Company in 1898.
The company's first automobile was an electric buggy so small and light that it weighed only 550 pounds with motor and batteries. The first buyer was Thomas Alva Edison, the man who supplied the batteries. Baker also developed the steering knuckle for the automobile front wheels, the full floating rear axle, and the first rear axle bevel gear, later adopted by the entire automobile industry.
The Peerless Manufacturing Company transitioned from making 10,000 bicycles per year to manufacturing transmissions and automotive parts. In 1900, Peerless produced a 700-pound motorette that boasted of reaching 25 miles per hour and traveled a distance of 30 miles on 1 gallon of gasoline.
Another successful automobile maker was Frank B. Stearns, who built his first car in the basement of his father's home in 1896. It ran so well that his father advanced him $1,000 to build a more elaborate machine shop behind their fashionable Euclid Avenue home. Another Cleveland automaker, Rowland White, built the first White steamer in 1900 in a shop shared with his father's sewing machine business, and a year later was producing 3 steamers a week.
All of these early motor pioneers established or enhanced their reputations by participating in organized speed competitions. In other words, they were racers. Ormond Beach near Daytona, Florida, lays claim to be the birthplace of speed. But a good argument could be made for Cleveland, given the significant developments that were achieved during this time within the city limits. As early as 1897, a 1-mile horse track in the Glenville neighborhood became known as the Glenville Driving Park when automobiles began racing there.
Obsessed with speed, Alexander Winton set a record mile on that oval track on May 30th, 1897 in 1 minute, 47 seconds. Winton also participated in the first Gordon Bennett Cup International race, which took place from Paris to Lyons in France in June of 1900.
Winton, being the first American to enter into a European race, was also the first casualty when a wheel collapsed. Fernand Chiron was declared the winner, although his vehicle was also a victim of mechanical ills. He arrived at the finish line so late that everyone but a handful of officials had already gone home.
By 1903, Cleveland was officially crowned the center of the motor vehicle industry, as noted in a 1903 issue of the Automobile magazine. To celebrate, Cleveland Mayor Tom Johnson led a procession of councilmen from Detroit, showing them the high points of Cleveland.
By 1903, Cleveland had at least 30 automobile companies under its belt, with such well-known brands as Winton, Baker, Peerless, and Stearns, which had already set up national distribution. So popular were automobiles that Winton soon set up public showrooms, which are considered by some to be the first successful automotive dealerships in the country.
So with automobile designers, developers, manufacturers, and racers from Cleveland, Ohio, driving the technology and automotive market in the early 1900s, why is Detroit considered the Motor City? The answer is simple: money! Back then, most banks considered the automotive industry a fad that would soon be gone, like a flash in the pan.
Detroit's banks, even though they were cautious, were more willing to take the risk in these types of ventures, more so than Cleveland banks. The spark that may have ignited Detroit's interest in investing might have been a single automobile race. The participants were Alexander Winton and Henry Ford.
The race was on October 10th, 1901, in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and was promoted as the World Champion Sweepstakes.
Winton was a sure bet to win, but as luck would have it, on the 8th lap, Winton experienced bearing failure and Ford won the race.
Even with his racing victory and some corporate restructuring, Henry Ford was not yet a major player in the automobile business. Nevertheless, the Detroit banks were now more open and willing to lend.
In June 1903, 2 years later, Henry Ford started his third company, the Ford Motor Company. Ford did not produce any big numbers until he introduced the Model T in 1908. According to industry legend, Henry Ford came to Cleveland many times to visit and consult with Alexander Winton.
The most notable dates: 1899, when Ford asked Winton for a job, and in 1908, when Ford asked Winton for engineering assistance on his Model T's planetary transmission. But in the end, Henry Ford's persistence in developing and selling new automobiles was likely the impetus that handed the crown of Motor City to Detroit instead of Cleveland.
Many innovative spin-offs and the formation of General Motors attracted a creative and willing workforce to Detroit from across the country. Detroit's first few big names, such as Oldsmobile and Ford, subcontracted a lot of their work out. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, Winton, Stearns, and Peerless were mostly self-sufficient and on their own, thereby limiting themselves to growth, while Detroit became the birth ground for companies like Cadillac, Buick, and General Motors.
But Cleveland didn't go down without a fight. The city automobile makers continued to build more than 80 brands through the 1910s and 1920s, all the way up to the last car produced by Peerless, which ceased production in 1931.
And after that, Cleveland still played a major role for many years as a chief parts supplier to Detroit. Even today, Cleveland can still boast about its rich automotive heritage.
The title, Motor City, may have changed hands over time, but the essence and aura of Cleveland's rich and colorful automotive history lives on.
Its legacy is clear. Cleveland was the first Motor City.